Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just speaking into the void? Well, with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills. Wait, did I say job title yet? Get started today and see how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started at linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply.
Hi there, it's Justin. Just before we jump into today's episode, I wanted to check something really important. Are you subscribed to my Think Faith newsletter? If not, you're missing out on articles, news, events, and updates. Subscribe today and I'll send you the first chapter of my Surprising Rebirth book. And one more thing, with the return of season 2 of the podcast, I would really value your monthly support to help me make this podcast looking at how the tide of faith is coming back in on the West. Become a silver supporter and you'll get early access to episodes plus exclusive bonus video content. Gold supporters also get signed copies of both my books and an invitation to The Inner Circle, a monthly catch-up with me on Zoom. For the newsletter or to support, go to the links with today's episode.
We believe that foundations are worth rediscovering. The best of our cultural heritage. Foundations from our liberal democratic history and foundations from our precious Judeo-Christian history. And that it is time to remember who we are.
The eternal message that's at the foundation of Western civilization is that we are each a divine locus of value.
And that idea that there is something above us, a higher power, that is rooted in Christianity, it's rooted in the Judeo-Christian traditions, it is superior to the nihilistic, Nietzsche-type atheistic theology.
In late 2023, the ARC conference in London gathered a wide range of conservative political thinkers and cultural influencers all under one roof, but with an interesting dynamic pinpointed by one of the speakers, Jonathan Pageau.
There's really an elephant in this room for the past few days. I've kind of noticed it, and everyone is kind of tiptoeing around it, and nobody is really addressing it. And to be honest, it's a little unnerving to me.
There are a lot of religious people in this room.
So just out of curiosity, how many people in the room here explicitly identify as belonging to a religious faith or religious tradition? Wow, okay.
ARC, which stands for the Alliance of Responsible Citizens, is the brainchild of popular psychologist and influencer Jordan Peterson and some of his friends, and seems to have the aim of bringing together a coalition of socially conservative individuals and agencies, along with Christian leaders and thinkers, concerned by what they see as the capture of culture by the progressive left. Alongside those involved in politics, a number of high-profile Christians are involved in leading ARC who seem to want to create a more faith-based response to the culture wars. Last week, we began our first episode of this new season of our podcast by asking the question, is the rebirth right-wing? Today, in part 2, as we continue to unpack that question, there's no doubt that the ARC conference represents an interesting new manifestation of the religious and political coming together. In fact, I was able to be present for the second ARC conference, which took place recently in London, this time in the wake of Trump's election, bringing a very different political backdrop to the proceedings. I plan to bring some interviews and reactions from guests and speakers there in a future episode of the show. Many of those I met and spoke to have been on their own surprising rebirth journey of discovering the value of Christian faith and embracing it for themselves. But many commentators, including influential atheist YouTuber Alex O'Connor, see the overlap of Christianity and politics in events such as the ARC conference as evidence that the surprising rebirth is primarily political.
I think people in the UK are quite sort of, especially right-wingers in the UK, are quite desperate. So like we don't have a movement, we don't have a home, we don't have a party that we can vote for. Like we don't have a way to get ourselves represented in Parliament. So what are we going to do? And they're sort of trying out different things. And one of these things is like, well, what if we all just become Christians again? You know, maybe that'll do something. But it means that if you pay attention on like Twitter to the kinds of because it's not just the thought leaders, but also like you begin to notice in the comments, you know, there's just more people. There are more people who are fervent. There's more people with little display pictures of like a crusader, you know, with the sword and the helmet on and stuff. And you realize that if there is sort of a Christian revival happening, it might be a revival of the sort of strong-armed, like we're not going to take this kind of Christianity.
Is Alex right? Is my thesis about a surprising rebirth of belief in God just a manifestation of the wider political vibe shift with a religious outfit on? Or is there more to the upswing in openness to faith than conservatives cosplaying at church? It's time to turn again to the question at hand. Is the rebirth right-wing? I'm Justin Brierley, and in this podcast series, I'm continuing to bring you the inside account of why a meaning crisis in the modern world and the search for a better story about life is leading many 21st century people to reconsider Christian faith. In this season, I'll be bringing you a mix of long-form interviews, live events, and our much-loved documentary episodes as I continue to explore whether we're seeing signs that the tide of faith is coming back in on the West. Welcome back to our second episode of Season 2 of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. Is the Rebirth Right-Wing? Part 2. I'm excited to share with you something that's been a source of both information and inspiration for me personally, the Worldview Bulletin newsletter. The Worldview Bulletin is your go-to source for exploring the Christian worldview and apologetics. Dive into thought-provoking articles that reveal the goodness, truth, and beauty of the Christian faith. Whether you're new to faith or a seasoned believer, the Worldview Bulletin offers free and paid options tailored to deepen your understanding. Start today at worldviewbulletin.substack.com or simply search Worldview Bulletin online. Be equipped, informed, and inspired. Subscribe now.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali, welcome to the show.
Alex, thank you very much for having me.
It's been an incredible year for you. Coming out as a Christian, dealing with the reactions and criticisms as a result of that. My first question is, how are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
Alex O'Connor recently sat down with someone he's accused of precisely the form of strong-armed Christianity that he suspects The Surprising Rebirth is a cover for, former New Atheist Ayaan Hirsi Ali. When she wrote her viral article about her embrace of Christianity, many derided it as a political conversion, including Alex himself. So I was intrigued to hear how she would respond to her critic.
The principal reaction that I saw from people is that here is an essay that talks about Trump, it talks about Putin, it talks about China, it talks about politics, and mentions the name of Jesus, I think, precisely once, mentions Richard Dawkins, mentions cultural factors, and a lot of people read this essay, Why I Am Now a Christian, and heard essentially a political treatise and thought, is Ayaan a Christian for essentially political reasons disconnected from the truth of the Christian doctrine? We're all delighted to see that this has changed your life and transformed you and that you're happy again. Yeah. I mean, nobody can disagree about that. But people will raise this question mark. Do you believe that it's true? Does that even matter to you?
I believe that it's true and it matters very much. And I think also I got a deluge of emails and papers all asking the same question, to what degree is this personal? Is this the political masquerading as personal? No, it is. It's. I believe it. What I will not do, which is, I think, hard for people like Richard, is take my 21st century brain and explain past century events. But I'm reading a lot. Reading the Gospels, I'm reading Old Testament, New Testament, I'm reading the apologetics. And a world is opening up for me that in many ways I find so fascinating and enriching.
I can fully understand Alex's questions, trying to pull apart the political and personal aspects of Ion's conversion, but she seems to have persuaded him that her conversion is a genuine one. But there's no doubt that her cultural concerns, often outlined in her popular Restoration Substack newsletter, played a significant factor in her intellectual journey towards being open to faith. Indeed, she first hinted about her change of mind when she spoke on stage at the ARC conference in late 2023. In part 1 of this episode, we heard journalist Heather Tomlinson's story of rebirth, both in becoming a Christian and becoming more conservative in her approach to politics and culture. She told me that the renewed interest in faith from the right is partly because many of her own generation feel let down by the failure of liberal values around sex, family, and politics, which has led to a breakdown in culture itself.
It seems to really have not worked. It seems to be breaking down at the moment. And that is, I think, leading to lots of people to question, well, what do we do now, kind of thing. And one of those strands of answer is in the Christian faith. And my belief is that is definitely the good way, the positive way to go. I also think, with anything that's happening, on a society level, on an individual level, there's a spiritual side as well. So this is the material side, or what Christians call worldly side of things like concerns about and the way our society is going and things like that. But there's also a spiritual side going on. And I think, God is at work. God loves people. He wants them to be in right relationship with him. And so whatever it appears to be, and that there's all these political things happening and concerns and whatnot, then there's very much a spiritual aspect to that too.
So here's the problem that a lot of people, when I've been on stages with, say, Alex O'Connor, talking about this stuff, he's said, Justin, this isn't a surprising rebirth of belief in God. It's a rebirth of people wanting the cultural values of traditional Christianity. And it is a political thing, basically. So don't try and pass it off as some kind of spiritual rebirth. What do you make of that basic criticism of this whole thing?
Often people who think like that have their own kind of left-wing biases. There might be a tendency to perceive right-wing people and beliefs in a negative way. So I think that's part of it. For some people, I mean, obviously so, that's the case. So I think with Jordan Peterson, I would say so. And with Douglas Murray, for example, I mean, they're openly saying, well, I can't make that jump of faith, but they like and appreciate the old sort of Christian values of culture. There are some people like that. But with some people, it's definitely not that. Ian Hessley definitely seems to me to have had a genuine a spiritual conversion, and lots of other people are the same. But I think that, again, there's a spiritual and a material side to everything. In the same way that I was, as a lefty, I was attracted to Jesus' teachings that would said, give money to the poor and things like this. And then obviously a right-wing person might be more attracted to his quite harsh sayings on personal responsibility and how that influences society positively. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Perhaps Alex O'Connor is a little bit, if you don't believe in the supernatural, then obviously you can't believe that there's anything spiritual going on and something spiritual or supernatural happening. But those of us who do believe, and have personal experience and evidence of that spiritual and supernatural side, can see that happening. There's certain people who seem to have been on the turn for a long time, like Russell Brand. That's no surprise. He's been on that journey for quite a long time. So the fact that he's recently, explicitly converted to Christianity isn't really a massive surprise. And you can see it in people. And I always joke when I'll say to a Christian friend, "Oh, they're on the turn, aren't they?" Because you could just tell in the way someone's writing about, these issues, you can just tell that God's doing something in them, and that's the path that they're on.
Yeah, I like your phrase, on the turn. I'd seen this progression definitely in Russell Brand's journey from quite a while back. He'd have kind of gone through sort of abandoning his old sort of drug-fueled, sex-addicted lifestyle to kind of this very spiritual turn, and kind of being open to lots of different things. And then suddenly, all seems to come together under the influence, presumably, of a few people in Christianity. Now, obviously, there's these outstanding allegations regarding abuse and so on in the past, which he denies, but, remains to be seen what happens in those cases. But more frequently, the criticism I run into when I sort of talk about Russell Brand in public circles is, again, from some Christians very often, is, but he's gone right wing. He's now, he's into all these conspiracy theories on his channel, and he's, on Tucker Carlson, and he's turning up at, the Trump Republican convention and all that sort of thing. So again, I mean, he seems to be falling into that same sort of pattern, arguably. What do you make of that? I mean, in his case, or generally in the fact that a lot of these conversions kind of seem to be going hand in hand with a move in certain right-wing directions.
So that's my own direction. And I've heard, not just in public figures, I've certainly listened to many stories of people who start out very left-wing and more atheistic or nominal Christianity. And as their faith has grown, they've become more conservative and or right-wing and or critical of the sort of liberal left wokeness and things like that. It depends where you're coming from, doesn't it? So Theo Wilmot, who I interviewed recently and you may be having on the show, so he came from a very extreme right-wing, like far-right ideology. And so when he came to Christ, then the areas that he was challenged in was his hatred and animosity towards gay people and people of different cultures. And so he's shifted in that direction. So he's what you might say is become more left-wing, but I think just more tolerant and kind and loving by the sound of it. But for other people who are very entrenched in left-wing attitudes and beliefs and about various, issues, then they're going to be challenged in a different direction. I think that's normal. But I think because intolerant left-wing beliefs are so entrenched, that's probably going to be happening more than the other way around, because I think there's more people who believe like that. But I think Christ challenges wherever you come from. Christ is doing a constant work of challenging beliefs, attitudes, behaviour, because he wants us to become loving people who follow, are led by the Holy Spirit and are living out his purposes in the world. So wherever you come from and whatever your beliefs, some things will get challenged. And I just think, that there's a lot of problems within left-wing culture at present that I think that's the reason why when people are coming to Christ, they're often rejecting that.
I'm convinced there are many people that find themselves on the right of politics who, for the reasons Heather gives, are opening up to the value of Christianity. But that doesn't mean they're converting. There are plenty of people, even well-known atheists like Richard Dawkins, happy to embrace the label of cultural Christian. Tech billionaire Elon Musk, Donald Trump's chief ally and executioner in the upending and purging of the US government, has recently been adopting the label himself.
Well, so, while I'm not a particularly religious person, I do believe that the teachings of Jesus are good and wise. Yeah, so I'm actually a big believer in the principles of Christianity. I think they're very good. So I'm probably a cultural Christian.
But as we explored in part 1, adopting Christian language or values isn't enough and can easily lead to a shallow and even idolatrous form of faith. Theo Wilmot, whom Heather Tomlinson mentioned, is an interesting example. At one time, he was part of a far-right organisation, hosting rallies and anti-immigration protests, but told me how, before his own spiritual awakening, he and his fellow activists believed they were, quote-unquote, Christian.
I remember calling myself a Christian, not having a clue what that meant, but just calling myself it because that was the old English faith. And so, I'm an English nationalist, so of course I'm a Christian. But as for what that meant, I didn't have a clue, and neither did any of the nationalist Christians I came to contact with. The gospel just wasn't, it was kind of gospel-free Christianity. The gospel just didn't form a part of it. And there was no prayer, it was unspiritual Christianity. It was kind of convenient cultural Christianity where we get to wag our fingers a lot and disapprove of a lot. And it was a sort of Phariseeism, really.
I asked Theo about what he makes of the renewed interest in faith from those on the right.
We are a Christian nation with a historically Christian culture and roots. And so I can see how someone who is sort of socially and morally conservative would find a lot that appeals to them in that, because if you're looking for to preserve the values and roots of our culture, not just in England or Britain, but in, the West, really. Yeah, it's Christian. So I can see the attraction, but I would certainly caution anyone who's coming from from that angle towards Christianity. I would say prepare to be changed and prepare to experience something far deeper than any of that, because there are people who come to the church through moral convictions and through values and ethics and whatnot, and even through a love of the history and all of that stuff, from a conservative angle, which is fine. It's not a bad reason, but it can't stop there. That's not really the core of the faith. The core of the faith is the person of Christ himself and the encounter with him through prayer and through one's neighbor. It's fantastic that people are coming from that angle, and if that's how they're getting into the church, then great. But it has to go far deeper than that, I think, to really bloom and bear good fruit.
Listen out for Theo's full Surprising Rebirth story towards the end of today's show. I'm personally encouraged, though, to see people like Theo Wilmot and Heather Tomlinson who are re-engaging faith from the right of politics. But like Theo and Heather, I don't want anyone to settle for a half-baked version of cultural Christianity, but to keep pulling on the thread and to find the Christ who transcends the politics of both left and right. And of course, not everyone who's part of the Surprising Rebirth movement is on the right wing. Remember this from season 1, celebrated author and poet Paul Kingsnorth telling his story of a life spent looking for transcendence in nature, Buddhism, and even Wicca, until a series of surprising events led to a major change.
And then I really started to have a sense that I was being dragged out of Wicca by something or someone and being told not to do this anymore. And I felt like I knew who it was, but I didn't want to think about that. But a lot of things happened to me, to cut a long story short, and it was partly a sort of intellectual dissatisfaction with what I was doing, but more than that, it was actually a lot of experiences. I felt like I was being really forcibly dragged towards Christianity, and I'm quite a new Christian. Only 2 or 3 years I've been in the church, and it's a weird thing in one way because I'm a member of the Romanian Orthodox Church. In my home, I'm not Romanian, but in another way, in a deeper way, it does feel like that. It feels like you've come back to something you sort of always knew. It's very prodigal son. You sort of feel like you're coming back to something. I did anyway. So I don't feel like I've converted to something weird and new and strange at all. I feel like I've gone, this is what I've been circling around my whole life. So it's a strange feeling.
Kingsnorth's story went viral after he published an account of his conversion on the First Things website. But Kingsnorth is concerned at the direction of travel of others he sees in this Surprising Rebirth movement. At the end of last year, he was invited to give First Things' annual Erasmus lecture and used it to speak of his concerns about the co-opting of Christianity for cultural and political ends in a message titled "Against Christian Civilization."
The essence of civilizational Christianity is the reshaping of this radically unworldly faith for very worldly ends, the defense of a certain kind of culture. The Gospels become a weapon in which to fight a culture war in a collapsing civilization. But confusing the Christian way with the way of that civilization is a fatal error. Love your neighbor, love your enemy, love God, do not resist evil, lay down your life for your friends, rule by serving, give away your wealth, let the dead bury the dead. We have our orders, and how we hate them, how I hate them. Sometimes I can't look at them or myself in their shadow. So, what do we want? Those of us who live in this age, in this strange culture of inversion, in this time of decline and confusion. Do we want a restoration or a transformation? Do we want war or repentance? Do we want civilization or do we want Christ? What if you could only have one or the other? It would be easy enough to fight for the West using anger and bitterness as our fuel. Plenty of people are doing it. Plenty more will join them. Because it's easy to identify the enemy. It's easy to forget that we're supposed to love him. And none of that is really good enough. Because none of that is Christian. And I'm saying all that to remind myself, as much as anywhere else, where the path lies and how to behave. In a challenging time like this, where does the path lie? I'm convinced that it does not lie in Christian civilization. It's in something much harder, certainly for me, which is Christian love.
It is an extraordinary lecture by Kingsnorth, worth listening to in full, and it reminded me of how easy it is to confuse Christendom with Christianity. And I share Kingsnorth's concern. If there is a religious and cultural revival coming, I want it to be one that centres on the countercultural message of Jesus. So this surprising rebirth movement, which I'm convinced is happening, is nevertheless complex. But it's the very existence of figures like Kingsnorth within it that lead me to disagree with the fundamental objection of friends like Alex O'Connor that this is a movement only fired by right-wing political concerns. When my book, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God, was published, one of the first reviews was a friendly but critical review by broadcaster Elizabeth Oldfield, author of the book Fully Alive. She was concerned that I'd overlooked the many people she was meeting from left-wing and progressive tribes who were also on a surprising rebirth trajectory. The subject came up between us during an edition of the Re-Enchanting podcast.
But that was a really helpful learning point for me, that actually often these people aren't necessarily the people who have the big stages, but there's something going on for everyone, whatever their demographic is, when it comes to this search for something more.
Yeah, I think and I am very, you and I are very much on the same page, that I am seeing a huge uptick in spiritual openness. It's easy for Christians to be both most comfortable with and find easiest to find stories of people who sit on the kind of right on centre right and have come really because of a sense of alignment with values, or Iron Hersey Ali might be one of those. One, I think all those individual stories are more complex. And two, I think I am seeing an equal level of spiritual openness opening up in different tribes. And so environmentalism, for example, there is a large number of people who have given their life to trying to halt or slow down the climate crisis and are now often in despair, right? And what they're coming up against is the broken, the breaking thingness of us.
I think of a Paul Kingsnorth in that sort of
background in the environmental movement. There are people, and this Martin Shaw would sit in this box a bit more, who have been in the more animist, kind of nature oriented spirituality, ritual and practice, sort of overlaps on one end with a kind of new age spirituality. And I'm always nervous of the language because I don't want to kind of self-describe for people who will be like, that's not how I think of myself. But those kind of moving groups of people who are seeking wisdom, who are seeking meaning, who are often deeply morally profound. There's a lot going on there. And it's causing some challenges, right? Paul Kingsnorth, Martin Shaw, other people in that network, a lot of people feel a bit betrayed, right? That because their associations with Christianity is of people who hate them. And that is toxic, that their associations are something that not as someone who comes to love their neighbor, but someone who will hate them and judge them. That is not a welcome posture. And I'm doing an event in a few weeks online with a friend, because I think there is a huge thing happening with people who are taking psychedelics and moving from a very closed atheist materialist worldview into something much more spiritually open. And that's taking people in all different directions. And I have all kinds of questions about what it means and what's healthy and what's unhealthy and how the church should respond. I do not have a clear policy on this yet. But what I can say is many of the people who want to come and talk about Jesus are in the aftermath of using psychedelics. And I just want to know how to be of use to them.
Did you know that leaving a rating and a review on your podcast app helps others to discover this show? Thanks to Bickwiser, who described it as something rare and precious, providing spiritually crafted brain food and a spiritual uplift. Sharing an episode with others on social media also makes a huge difference. But the way you can make the biggest difference to this show is by supporting my work, either via Patreon from anywhere in the world or through US tax-deductible giving from the USA. Either option gets you the same perks. Become a silver supporter and you'll get early access to episodes plus exclusive bonus video content. Gold supporters also get signed copies of both my books and the chance for a monthly catch-up with me on Zoom. And I get so much out of those catch-ups with supporters myself. I really love them. So to support, just go to the links with today's episode info.
Clorox Sentiva smells like lavender. Cleans like Clorox. And feels like...
All right, that could go on for a while. Experience the long-lasting freshness of Clorox Sentiva, now available in Clorox Sentiva Lavender-Scented Bleach. Use as directed.
This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Pet injury is an additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
Over the course of season 1 of this podcast, I introduced a number of conservative, secular thinkers moving away from atheism and reconsidering Christianity. Yet there are plenty of left-leaning academics too, if you go looking for them. For instance, Marxist historian Terry Eagleton has written devastating critiques of new atheism. He famously compared Dawkins' writing on theology to someone holding forth on biology whose only knowledge on the subject is the Book of British Birds. And like the historian Tom Holland, Eagleton has repeatedly pointed out to his secular contemporaries that Christianity's central story of self-sacrificial love is the revolutionary force that has most shaped the moral arc of the West. Eagleton is no believer, however, but here he is in 2018 talking about why Christianity's emphasis on fallenness and sin is fundamental to his own take on revolutionary politics.
Christianity says that the world is so warped and so governed by rather dark powers, not political powers, that you can't change that, transform it, unless you have a very thoroughgoing transformation of the self and the society. In other words, in that sense, Christianity is too radical, understood properly, for a lot of people. A lot of good liberals, middle ground, people who don't really believe that, who don't really think things are that bad. One of the first questions you have to ask somebody, I think, when you're talking about atheism or Christianity is, how bad do you think it is? See? And a lot of people would say, not that bad, there's a lot of progress, it's true. But I think Christianity believes that things are fundamentally pretty bad. Human history has been a long nightmare of torture and injustice and bloodshed and how are you going to change that? See? Well, whatever could change, it just has to cut very deep. Yeah. And that's really what Christianity is about. You have to confront the possibility of death and rebirth.
Another popular voice who's been candid about his own unlikely re-embrace of Catholicism is Aaron Bastani, founder of the left-wing media channel Novara Media.
In terms of the role of religion, for me personally, I have to say, going back to it, the Gospels are an incredibly powerful way to live your life. You don't need to believe in it. I mean, faith obviously helps, but actually the idea of repentance, forgiveness, asking for forgiveness, loving your enemies is transformative. If I ever feel like crap, I pray for forgiveness and I forgive the people who've done me wrong. And I always feel better very, very quickly. The world that we live in of culture and personal injury actually is at odds with some of those ideas of forgiving people and asking for forgiveness. There's nothing wrong with secular society, but I think a secular society where capitalism is rampant, where all that matters is money and profit, and where people's interests come second, actually, once you start to encounter up close and personal some of the values, beliefs, institutions of something like Catholicism, which has many downsides, many problems, we'll talk about that too, but it still is a different world, it's a different way of doing things, a different way of engaging with life and other people. And I found that very powerful, very moving.
Let me bring you just one more example of why I believe this rebirth is not a merely right-wing phenomenon. Rasool Berry, pastor of the Bridge Church in Brooklyn, New York City, was another person who offered helpful feedback following the publication of my book. He told me how, even in a very left-leaning city like New York, the hub of cosmopolitan culture and progressive entertainment, his own church is seeing hundreds of young seekers turn up every Sunday.
In the city where this kind of like hub of business and enterprise is happening, yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, you could feel very isolated in trying to figure out what it means to live out your faith. And definitely there are different convictions that we have about in seeing the world that would be considered out of step, old-fashioned, even offensive. And yet at the same time, I do think that we also see that desire and hunger for re-enchantment in the places that we live. Like there's almost this intrigue that can be there with folks who are living so counterculturally, and that they are curious, about how we live. And I think that there's opportunities if we come to that with a humble confidence, a humble boldness. Manhattan in particular is because Brooklyn is known as the borough of churches, because in Queens, I mean, you're talking significant immigrant populations who bring with them significant faith traditions, and not just Christian, of course. I mean, there's over 1 million Muslims that live in New York City. There's some, major, Buddhist temples and Sikh and all the different things. And so there is a certain type of story that we tend to think of that's like the Sex in the City, kind of vision, and that definitely exists. But that's not the only story that exists as well. It's all these things coming together. We do need to create a robust, really confident, thoughtful expression of the faith that to equip believers with in this place. And when they find that, I think that they can thrive.
Heather Tomlinson told me that she believes we can also over-imagine the political dimension of this surprising rebirth phenomenon.
I do believe one of the reasons that people are converting is because people are becoming more frightened. We've lived in an unprecedented era of peace, stability, prosperity in the West. And that does seem to be declining and possibly coming to an end. And many people are very frightened. And the natural thing to do when you're frightened is to turn to God. There's no atheists in foxholes. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. In fact, I think it's a very good thing. If you feel fear, start praying, turn to God. God will help you with that fear. I absolutely believe that.
I asked Heather how Christians who, like her, have political opinions, but also want to see a rebirth of faith that transcends the culture wars, should go about engaging with others.
I think we really need to individually challenge our own biases and to try and hear the perspectives from the other side, whatever side we happen to find ourselves on. Why are people who think so differently to me? Why do they think that? And even if they seem really angry, and they might even be quite insulting, as they are on Twitter. But, to work towards, certainly not the best example of it, but to work towards letting that, wash over and to say, okay, well, why do you think that? And what can we say about it? But I think the church as a whole, we really need to start openly talking about this. That's the first thing, because it's such a difficult subject. We're so afraid of offending people, not just, being afraid of being called racist. That is definitely one fear, but also afraid of being called liberal. If you're in quite a conservative church, then, certain progressive opinions won't be tolerated. But how can we start having better conversations and bringing people together and, to not just dismiss various beliefs, attitudes, people, and to seek to love them.
I think Heather has this absolutely right. I've always been a big fan of enabling better conversations that allow us to approach even those we disagree with as people to be engaged rather than ideas to be demolished. Krish Kandiah, a Christian who's arguably on the political left compared to Heather, nevertheless shared a very similar sentiment with me and Belle Tyndall in a recent edition of the Re-Enchanting podcast.
I believe there's truth. I believe there's a right way of reading scripture, but I don't think I've always got it completely right. And so spending time with people that are very different politically, socially, culturally, is actually really healthy for me. And I quite like that. I am absolutely convinced that Christianity is true and the scriptures are inspired. I'm bold about that, but I'm humble about my interpretation. And therefore, sitting down, going on these crazy news channels with views I don't agree, actually, I need to have the humility to say that sometimes the other side are going to get things right.
Do you have any other tips on how we can kind of transcend this?
Yeah.
You versus me, good versus bad.
I talk about the power of proximity. I gave a talk recently about welcoming refugees, hospitality, and someone came up to me at the end and said, "Oh, I don't agree. I think all these guys are coming here to sponge off the state, and we should have the Rwanda program because then they won't want to come here in the first place." I said, "Oh, okay. Well, what do you do?" He said, "Oh, I help people that have got themselves into debt." I go, "That's interesting." Some people have prejudices about people that have got themselves into debt. They think, why would you bother helping them? It's their own fault. If they don't have so many lattes and Netflix and gym memberships, then they'd be able to pay for their, all their bills. And I said, but I bet you've spent time with people that are struggling with debt, and those stereotypes aren't true. And there are all sorts of reasons that lead to people getting into really difficult situations with their money. I just think we need to show the same willingness to listen to refugees and asylum seekers. So let's spend some time. So I do think if you spend time with the people that you think are the big problem, either way, your mind will be changed, right? You will find out that there's another human being at the other end of this Twitter conversation, or there's another human being at the other end of this political debate. And as you do that, you can probably find some common ground. You humanize the other person, and then you realize I can't speak like that about these people. I've got to find another way of understanding.
Elizabeth Oldfield, who hosts the Sacred podcast, dedicated to hearing from people across political, religious and cultural divides, says actually listening to each other is essential.
The Sacred, when I started it, as it turns out, is a counterformative practices for me and some listeners. The amount of people that we get saying, I thought this person was a monster. As it turns out, I agree with them on this, this and this. They're a human being. I can see how they got to where they are. Still don't necessarily agree with them, but my heart has softened sufficiently that it is much harder for me now to dehumanize them. And that's the poison. So we can draw the poison of dehumanization out of it, then we can disagree in ways that don't break us at that deep level. Yeah. And so the practices that I talk about are be someone who crosses tribes, be someone who deliberately and explicitly and repeatedly, even if your friends raise an eyebrow at you, are seen with people that you should not be seen with, listen to people that you should not listen to, both in your media environment and in your home environment and in your world. Actually and literally pray for your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. There is nothing that more quickly drains the contempt out of me than forcing me to pray for someone.
In the end, I believe that if the Surprising Rebirth is going to bear the fruit of a real spiritual revival in the West, then it will do so because wherever the gospel takes root, it somehow manages to test, transform, and transcend the cultural, political, and social differences of the places where it is sown. It's a central idea of Chris Watkin's award-winning book, Biblical Critical Theory.
So there are some things in any culture that the Bible will shine a spotlight on and say that is not good. And yet at the same time, it fulfills the deepest values and longings of those cultures in a way that they could never have been fulfilled at such a deep level, in such richness without them. And so the Bible comes into any culture in terms of what Dan Strange and others recently have called subversive fulfillment. It completely pulls the carpet out from under the culture, and yet at the same time allows the culture to be more of itself than it ever was, in a sort of death and resurrection type dynamic. And I think that's why Christianity has spread across the globe in a way that other religions haven't, in the sense that where is the sort of epicenter, where's the center of gravity of Christianity? Over time, well, it shifts. It starts off in the Middle East. There's a time when it's sort of in Europe, although there are rich, Christian traditions happening in the Far East and other countries during that time. Probably a time when it was in the US, perhaps less so over time now. Where's the centre of Christianity? Korea at the moment, perhaps. Numerically speaking, probably the African continent. That's not usual. World religions usually have an epicenter that stays the epicenter over time. Christianity is all over the map, literally. And I think it's for this reason that it's not trying to drag every culture that it meets to some sort of static baseline, but it's helping every culture that it encounters to become more of itself than it ever was, in a way that also subverts aspects of it.
Of course, historically, the church has always had a complex and often compromised relationship with politics. Seeking to help the global church not repeat the mistakes of the past, biblical scholar NT Wright's recent book, Jesus and the Powers, is a reminder that whether left or right gain office, and whether or not the government we're ruled by are even democratically elected in the first place, the church should always be speaking truth to power wherever it finds itself.
And one of the things that struck me, whenever it was 15 years ago at the Lambeth Conference, talking to church leaders from South Sudan, from Myanmar, from different parts of Latin America, the different situations politically and socially are so diverse that there's no one size fits all. And the difference between being a British Anglican in Britain and being an Anglican in Canada, say, or Australia, is quite marked. And so it's very difficult to say yes to this and no to that. I want to say in each situation, there's a call for discernment. What are we to say to the powers and authorities now? And I take the bottom line here, as in Jesus' response to Pilate, as in John 16, when the Spirit comes, the Spirit will convict the world of sin and righteousness and judgment and so on, that it's a basic 101 level Christian commitment to speak truth to power. We have backed right off from that in the last 3 centuries. We've said, no, our truth is a spiritual truth, so we'll say it to one another in church and when we say our prayers, but then the politicians must sort out their stuff how they want. No, actually, democracy is fine, and we argue for liberal democracy in this book as being the least worst of the possible options, but the church has an inalienable vocation to hold a mirror to power, to speak the truth to power.
Naturally, if there is a rebirth underway, then it will throw up all kinds of complications. I've no doubt that a reaction against woke identity politics is among the factors involved in this trend, especially among young men, who the polls tell us are growing more conservative than young women. The same forces that put Donald Trump back in the White House may also be responsible for sending men back to church. We'll be exploring the extraordinary boom in young men seeking faith in the Catholic, Orthodox, and other churches in a future episode of this season. Likewise, there are those who want to bring back cultural Christianity for a political agenda. It may be you believe that cultural Christianity is better than no Christianity, or you may reject the idea of embracing Christianity for utilitarian purposes. Whatever your take on this debate, it's clear that there are people attracted to faith who fall across various points of the spectrum, and plenty of mixed motives spurring on this surprising rebirth moment. But whatever concerns we may rightly raise, let's not forget that something is happening. There is an opportunity to be grasped here. And whether they find themselves on the left or right, I'm encountering more and more people who are hungry for more than politics can offer them. And I'd like to tell you about one of them next.
Claire is practicing her breathing for her upcoming yoga retreat in Bali. Has she ever done yoga before? No. But Claire worked with Empower on her savings and investment strategy. She got good at money, so she can be a little bad. Empower. Invest well, live a little. Join our 19 million customers today at empower.com.
Past performance is not indicative of future returns. Investing involves risks. You may lose money. Advisory services are provided for a fee by Empower Advisor Group, LLC, EAG, a registered investment advisor with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Om Namaste.
Saturday presents, in the red corner, the undisputed, undefeated Weed Whacker Guy. Champion of hurling grass and pollen everywhere. And in the blue corner, the challenger, extra strength Saturday. Eye drops that work all day to prevent the release of histamines that cause itchy allergy eyes. And the winner by knockout is Saturday. Saturday, bring it on.
This episode is brought to you by Shopify. Forget the frustration of picking commerce platforms when you switch your business to Shopify, the global commerce platform that supercharges your selling wherever you sell. With Shopify, you'll harness the same intuitive features, trusted apps, and powerful analytics used by the world's leading brands. Sign up today for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/tech, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/tech.
Let me introduce you to Theo Wilmot. In his early adult years, Theo was an activist for the far-right group Patriotic Alternative. I sat down with Theo to talk through his story, and just a warning as we begin that our conversation includes some references to miscarriage and abortion. Tell us a little bit about yourself growing up. What were some of the influences on you? What was kind of childhood like for you? And did religion, God, figure much in it yourself?
God did not figure much in it, and nor did religion. My parents divorced when I was very young, so that was a big deal for me as a boy. Our mother went to a Church of England parish every week, and we were kind of dragged along. I stopped going as soon as I was allowed, and my sister did the same. Yeah, so growing up, it was not rooted in the faith, and sort of mad in the ongoing custody battles and controversy. Which had split the family, unfortunately.
By his teens, Theo says he began gravitating towards drink and drugs.
Yeah, as you're experimenting as a young man, it quickly becomes apparent that some people can dip their fingers into different things and try things out and then put them away again and still kind of function. Quickly became clear that I wasn't one of those people. And so I if I was going to drink or if I was going to smoke or if I was going to do anything, I was going to do it a lot. Yeah, I think I would be best described as a young man as a nihilist. I was not aspirational. I didn't have anything I particularly wanted to achieve. Because of my substance abuse, dropped out of school at 16. Yeah, and then got into a couple of romantic relationships and things like that, as you do as a young man. And some of those were as you can imagine, chaotic. Probably not a great start to my kind of adult social life or romantic life either.
When did you start picking up political leanings and that kind of thing? What was leading you in the direction that you eventually went in terms of being a supporter of Patriotic Alternative?
It was kind of a crossing of the aisles. Both my parents growing up were Labour voters, and so I always very much grew up kind of on the left, with the sense that that was where my family stood. Sort of chaos ensued as a result of my lifestyle, my addiction, and the young lady who I was in a relationship with, how that relationship turned out, and how we lost our children.
Tell me a bit about losing the children. This was through abortion. How did that strike you?
It was the most kind of formative experience of my life, probably. We were both engaging in the same kind of lifestyle, and sexually active, and not taking any kind of precautions or even thinking about what the consequences might be. So inevitably, she fell pregnant the first time, and we didn't find out that she was pregnant until sadly she had a miscarriage. She went to a music festival and was drinking and whatever. And that weekend bender at the music festival caused a miscarriage. And so, which was a shock to the system of two 19-year-olds realizing, that there was this child, and that through our lifestyle, through our actions, that child was no more. So that hit us like a ton of bricks, of course. And in hindsight, you would think, well, why not stop then? Don't do that again, obviously. And we continued our lifestyle, including the sexual aspect of it. So a few months later, she fell pregnant the second time. And on that occasion, there was no miscarriage. We did a pregnancy test, and it turned out she was pregnant. We discussed it, and she thought about it. And she chose ultimately to have an abortion. I accompanied her, and that was, every bit as horrible as all the testimonies. But still, even after that, we still did not change our lifestyle. We continued down that road. And so the following year, she fell pregnant a third time, collapsed at work, collapsed and was taken to hospital. And it turned out that she was pregnant, but the child was, again, due to our lifestyle, due to our substance abuse, the child was deformed in the womb. And that was our third child lost. And so, of course, that was sort of a world-shaking experience for both of us, figuratively and literally. It was after that I really seriously tried to get sober. And then that also fed into my investigation of politics. So as I sobered up and as I tried to understand what had gone wrong in our relationship and in our lives and how we had got to that point, I looked for, solutions through philosophy, through political writings, and because I wasn't seeing those solutions or those answers to my pressing, heartfelt questions in the kind of mainstream of, liberal party politics, and nor was I seeing them on the kind of left-wing side of the aisle where I'd come from initially. So I started reading and I started looking for answers. And at the same time, I was newly sober and also looking for, sort of unconsciously looking for my next crutch, because, that's something you learn as an addict is when you quit one thing, there's a tendency to want to immediately substitute something else. So as I went down the rabbit hole of kind of more extreme, more radical forms of politics, that became a kind of new drug for me, a new crutch. Because of what had happened over the past couple of years with me and my relationship and with my children, I was sort of politically switched on. I was paying attention to all of this stuff because I was trying to factor it all into what had happened to me personally and understanding where things had gone wrong and how they might be set right. And very interested in this new movement, which was largely online, but was moving offline gradually. And it was, I suppose, socially conservative in some ways, but also kind of radical in its approach in other ways. And alongside that, started reading some of the historical texts which fed into that movement from the old, fascist movements. I was reading Sir Oswald Mosley, I was reading some of the German writers. And by the time Patriotic Alternative came along at sort of the end of 2019, I believe, I was kind of primed and ready to get stuck in. It was founded to bring British nationalists together and work towards a party in future. And so we had regional groups around the UK. I was in charge of the Southeast regional group. I was the regional organizer. We called ourselves ethno-nationalists, and we were concerned, especially with the demographic decline of the native peoples of the British Isles. We opposed mass immigration, of course, and we were also in favor of resettlement programs.
Why did that kind of program, that way of kind of ordering society and culture, appeal to you at that time? What was it about that particular, worldview that made you think this will serve me better and my community better and so on?
There's a couple of things, really. One thing would be that the context of kind of, I came from the left, and the left didn't offer me any answers or offer me any even consolation for the grievances which I had. But in hindsight, I think that was a big part of it. And secondly, had a lot of guilt and grief and anger that I was carrying around due to my part in what happened to my children. And I projected a lot of that out onto the world. Why was I allowed to live like that? Why was I allowed to harm my children like that? And shouldn't somebody have stopped me? And I looked at the kind of muscular rhetoric I saw in some of the old fascist literature and some of the new alt-right media. It was very attractive, and it was attractive to scapegoat. It's a lot easier to look at, liberals and immigrants and Jewish people and see them as the causes of one's woes than having to look within and address one's own sin.
Theo says that his political activism with Patriotic Alternative gave him a sense of purpose and identity that he had been looking for.
Yeah, it was my whole identity and structure of my life, was writing for PA and running the events, and it gave me a crusade as well. It was me against the mainstream media and the Antifa and whoever was against me.
So tell us about some of the events and the way you got stuck in, and just what was involved, some of the, I know, clashes that inevitably occurred, how that it eventually ended up changing your thinking about the movement.
Yeah, well, I ran regular events and mobilizing people. And so that would be leafleting campaigns. We had a big annual campaign every Indigenous Peoples Day, and then occasionally sort of bigger, more dramatic pieces of activism. Like at one point we went to Dover and projected our logo and our slogans up on the White Cliffs. As far as the violence, it was a case of, we would often have events, and we were quite careful because we were aware that, there were factions who opposed us over on the left, Antifa and similar groups, anarchist groups and whatnot. There were clashes, some of which were, violent. And the final month that I was running events before I called it a day, which would have been October 2020, when I was attacked in Sevenoaks. And when I arrived, one of the first people to come to the event said to me, "There's something happening over the other side of the car park. There's a lot of lads all dressed in black over there." And I said, "Oh, that doesn't sound good." And then next thing you know, they just charge across the car park. So I was mobbed by, about 40 people. Glory to God, I wasn't badly injured. I had a bit of a sore head. And that was the last event that I ran for PA. That was when I had my kind of moment of clarity. I had talked myself into the idea that I had gone into politics to help, especially, young British youngsters, and to try and fight for their future and for their well-being. So I was on the floor, being kicked in the head and in the gut, and looking up at a whole crowd of exactly the kind of people that I wanted to help. But instead of helping one another, we were just kicking the hell out of each other. There was a deep sense that, where on earth did this all go wrong? Why are we doing this to each other? The kind of political games that I had been engaging in were not terribly helpful, and were actually just producing this kind of violence. And I saw that if I continued, and if we continued as a movement to do that, it would only yield more of the same. It would only yield more violence. I didn't get out immediately, but that was kind of the moment that set me on a different trajectory. By the time spring came around of the following year, 2021, quit PA, stopped writing for them, stopped organizing events. Once I had distanced myself from all that, I found myself sort of in a bit of a moral vacuum. Politics had been my latest drug, and now I was kind of cold turkey again, and had a breakdown in 2021. I had to quit my job. I just stayed in my flat and, was too anxious, too paranoid. Something that happened during those months as well, as I had become a bit more visible and a bit more notorious. My dress had been leaked and I had found myself being followed. I was followed on my way to work sometimes, people trying to find out where I worked. And so I had to move house. I had to quit my job, and basically got to the point where I couldn't even go outside or do anything. So it was at that point that my father recommended I try prayer. He said, okay, let me send you a book. And he sent me a little book called The Jesus Prayer by Metropolitan Callisto Swear of blessed memory. So I thought, okay, I can't cope with anything. I can't really do anything at the moment. But maybe I can do this because it's a simple little prayer. And so I read the book and I thought, okay, I can say that prayer and just sit in my flat and say a prayer and then say another one. And so I tried to start building up a habit of saying the Jesus prayer every day. And I started to feel different. I started to wonder who this Jesus was, because I was saying his name hundreds of times a day in the prayer.
For those who don't know what the Jesus prayer is, could you just recite the Jesus prayer?
Yeah, sure. The most common version, I think, is, and the version which I first learned is, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Some of the Greek fathers talk about it as kind of a mini gospel, basically. You have the name of Jesus, and then you're confessing him as the Lord and the Christ and the Son of God, and you're asking for his mercy, and you're confessing to being a sinner. So it's the whole gospel is kind of wrapped up in this little string of words. And so I started praying the prayer as a way to cope, but then inevitably got curious about who I was praying to and what all those little theological references meant. And so a friend of mine kindly gave me a copy of the Bible, started reading the Gospels, went back to the beginning, started from Genesis, started praying the Psalms, and continued with my Jesus prayer every day. And that was kind of my first introduction to Christianity, was through the prayer and through reading the scriptures.
Were there any particular pivotal moments or people you met or communities that you started to become part of that helped you in that journey?
Yeah, sure. It started off as very much as a solitary thing of just me finding ways to cope. But eventually it started to change and to have a sense of hope. So I carried on for a while as in that kind of solitary, but inevitably, reading things like the Acts of the Apostles. And if I was going to be a Christian, it wasn't something that I would do on my own, sitting in my flat. So I started visiting churches. I still didn't have a clue. One of the first was a Protestant church, a Vineyard church. I met some wonderful people there who were just incredibly welcoming and supportive and understanding of that I was still struggling in many ways. And there was one gentleman in particular who made a special effort to welcome me, and he himself was an immigrant from East Asia, and he was referred to himself as gay. He was a homosexual man, very much like the polar opposite of anyone I would have associated with a year or two prior. And yet he went out of his way to befriend me and welcome me kind of in my hour of need. When I was at my lowest ebb, he was there for me. And though I didn't end up joining the Vineyard Church, I ultimately discovered a Roman Catholic church nearby to where I lived and was ultimately baptized there. But I remember him very fondly in his community, and he gave me a gift at one point, which was a wooden cross with the Serenity Prayer, which would be familiar to anyone who's been through kind of Alcoholics Anonymous type programs. And he said, this prayer may help. And so he gave me this cross. Well, that was my first experience of what I had read about, when the Lord in the gospel talks about serving the least or the lowliest and finding Christ in them. It's one thing to read about that, and then it's another thing to experience that Christ-like welcome where you least expect it, and to have to completely reevaluate the way that you had approached other people and had seen people up to that point. That was a kind of pivotal moment, and will be forever grateful to him.
That's a beautiful story. Did the church represent something different? Was it more than just another crutch, another drug in that sense?
what it did was it sort of flipped me inside out, whereas I had always looked for external crutches, and even in politics I'd always looked at the externals. I was very interested in what other people were doing and how they were impacting my nation, and how we should all change how we lived and how we structured our ways of life. And that was all very external, but I wasn't looking inside myself. What I found at church was the opposite. It was a call to look inside myself. I heard the Lord saying, that evil doesn't come from outside, it comes from in a man's heart. At the same time, talking about how the kingdom of heaven is not outside. It's not something that we find somewhere out there. It's actually within us. I found this call to go inside and to go deeper. And as a boy, I never experienced it. Unfortunately, something that's missing in a lot of churches is that emphasis on the truly spiritual. There's a lot of talk about kind of social issues and whatnot, but I never heard about that as a boy. And then later on, I never found that on either side of the political spectrum. I never found it in sort of mainstream party politics. I never found it, anywhere in our culture until I was introduced to kind of traditional Christian teaching.
Where do you find yourself now? I'm sure you're still a work in progress, as we all are.
Well, life now is shockingly different than it ever was before. In His great mercy, He granted me that hope, to see that even though I've done terrible things and terrible things have been done to me, which have sort of damaged me in various ways, and I'm still kind of damaged, and I'm still not exactly a saint, far from it, but there's hope, and it changes everything in life, being able to see things in that light. I always think of how Christ is referred to as the Redeemer. He doesn't waste anything. He takes everything and makes it good. And no matter how wretched some of my past actions were and the things I was involved with, he's taking my life and trying to turn it towards the good. So I'm trying my best to cooperate with that.
For now, the only direct activism Theo finds himself involved in is of a peaceful variety, supporting the pro-life movement. And Theo says he no longer sees politics as the solution to the spiritual problems in our culture.
I don't really think I can achieve anything. The best I can hope for is that I'll be a sort of useful instrument for the Lord to achieve whatever He has in store, which is a completely different approach to when you're a kind of driven secular political activist, where you have your program and your ideas, and I had all of that, and I was driven to beat everyone over the head with them, basically. My only interest really now is in the gospel and what I can do to help build up the church in some small way.
Theo Wilmot's journey from far-right activism to confessing faith is a reminder that there are all kinds of long and winding roads that can lead to a surprising rebirth story. Jesus once told a parable about a man who sowed wheat in his field, but an enemy came by night and sowed weeds. When the wheat and the weeds grew up together, his servants asked if they should pull up the weeds, but the farmer told them to allow both to grow up, lest they pull up the good wheat alongside the weeds. In the final harvest, they could separate the good and the bad, just as God will be the judge of right and wrong in the final harvest of all things. I've no doubt that a good many of those finding their way to faith today are being influenced by the resurgence of right-wing politics, and there will be mixed motives and political purposes at play for many who want to rebuild a Christendom with cultural values rather than Christ at the centre. Whatever the political dimension of this rebirth, churches who wish to receive a new wave of meaning seekers will need to find a way of transcending the usual political fault lines and offering something more substantive than a cultural Christianity co-opted for a conservative revival. At the same time, and bearing in mind Jesus' parable about the wheat and the weeds, I sincerely believe God can cope with the muddled ways that people often come to Him, including those who gravitate towards Christianity for less than perfect political motivations and maybe end up stumbling upon the real thing. Wisdom and discernment is needed along the way, But let's not miss the fact that there is a harvest to be brought in, and let's leave God to be the final judge. You've been listening to the surprising rebirth of belief in God with me, Justin Brierley, continuing to tell the story of why many secular 21st century people are considering Christianity again. I hope you enjoyed the start of our new season. Please do rate and review the podcast and share it with others. This podcast is also a book. You can read chapter 1 for free when you subscribe to my newsletter. And if you'd like to help me reach many more people with Thinking Faith, please consider becoming a monthly supporter of my work. Silver supporters get early access to new episodes, as well as bonus content, and gold supporters also get signed copies of my books and a monthly catch-up call with me. The links are with the show notes. Coming up next time.
Liberalism gets you only so far. I want more. And so I have decided to become a Christian.
Criticism at the time you wrote your article, this is a cultural conversion, a political thing, this is about civilizational war.
There is a clash. Not so much a military clash as a clash of ideas. Real struggle is a spiritual struggle. These are the ideas we ought to be talking about and we ought to be passing on to younger generations. In fact, the failure to pass it on to younger generations is criminal.
At a recent Cambridge event with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I had the opportunity to put some of the questions raised in this episode to the former atheist and political commentator. Find out what happened next time as we bring you that live recording of her conversation and audience Q&A. But remember, you can listen to or watch that episode early, right now, in fact, when you become a silver or gold supporter. And there's some exclusive bonus videos you'll access too. We've just added my full interviews with statistician Ryan Burge and church leader Trevin Wax on why the rise of the nuns has stopped and the growing spiritual openness among Gen Z. Again, the links are with the show notes. The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God is a production of Think Faith, editing assistance by Isaac Simmons. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.
In a way, it ends where it begins.
Very insightful.
Thank you for sharing this Red Baron with us, Linda. It's so tasty, it makes me want to share something of my own. I didn't actually read the book.
Me neither.
I watched the movie last night.
I judged it by its cover.
I haven't read a book since middle school.
I'm secretly seeing 2 other book clubs.
And I can't even read.
I'm not really Gary. He just paid me to be here. Sharing Red Baron pizza can lead to more sharing.
The Christian faith is not going away in postmodern Western culture, but actually has the potential to grow exponentially again in our time. That was how one reviewer was left feeling after reading the book that this podcast is based on. Why not grab yourself a copy of The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God and find out why new atheism grew old and secular thinkers are considering Christianity again. You can even purchase a signed copy exclusively from my website. Just go to the book link with the podcast info.